Hello, good morning everybody. This is Sarah Sladen from Making Sense International. Thank you for joining today's webinar, co-hosted by RTI International. This webinar is part of Making Sense International's Youth Economic Opportunities Network, a global hub dedicated to advancing knowledge exchange, collaboration, and action among stakeholders working to expand youth economic opportunities. We're very excited to have participants joining us from around the world today. We have 246 people registered from 46 countries, so thank you for joining today's discussion. Thank you also to RTI for hosting and to our speakers for sharing your expertise. Webinar participants, we welcome your questions and contributions throughout this virtual learning event. Please write them into the chat box that's located at the lower right-hand corner of your screen. We also welcome your tweeting and Facebook posts on key points you take away from the event using the hashtag GYEO. Our speakers for today's event are Sarah Mattingly at RTI. Sarah is an economic growth specialist with more than 15 years of experience in workforce development, microenterprise, livelihood, agriculture, local capacity building, and new business development. We're also joined by Dr. Jared Willicott. Jared is an RTI senior economist specializing in economy-wide modeling, including estimating employment, incomes, and value-added impacts of policies and programs. And Dr. Willicott's work has helped governments, agencies, and organizations better understand how changes in one sector of the economy influence outcomes in other sectors. And finally, we're joined by Rachel Bloom. Rachel has 20 years of experience in inclusive growth in developing countries and conflict-affected areas with a specialization in youth employment. Rachel currently works as the Senior International Technical Advisor for the Youth and Workforce team at EDC, and she's also consults with donors and implementing partners on the design and evaluation of programs that integrate youth into market systems. Prior to EDC, Rachel was at USAID as a leading technical focal point for USAID's $85 million global portfolio in higher education and youth workforce development. So Sarah, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. So thank you to everyone for joining us today. We're very excited to share some of the work we've been doing at RTI that's based out of our LEVE program, which is a value chain program in Haiti, but we've worked across the Institute with some of our other departments to develop some interesting tools to gauge economic impact of our workforce programs. So today we're going to, I'll give a quick introduction, talk a little bit about the program in Haiti, then I will turn to Jared Willicott to talk about the model, and then we will hear responses from Rachel. She is actually worked on the design of this program while she was at USAID and is one of the lead thinkers in the youth area. So she'll be able to respond and then open it up for questions. So let me move to the next slide. So first, just a quick overview about LEVE. It's a value chain project with the objectives of adding economic impact as well as through growing jobs and upgrading the workforce. We are working in 3 different sectors, construction, apparel, and textiles, and agribusiness. This particular topic will focus on the textiles work we're doing. Our goal is to increase number of jobs, and we use a couple different tools for that. The biggest one that we're looking at is we use technical assistance, both to support the enterprises that we're working with. We work primarily through what we call lead entities. Those are entities, usually small, medium enterprises that are willing to take a risk in an effort to push the sector, whether through new technologies, through other ways of adding value. So we're providing technical assistance to those entities, the SMEs, as well as the MSMEs that they work with. We're also looking at the workforce. I think in Haiti it's clear that one problem is the skills gap. So we're looking at how we can improve the employees. And then the last thing is co-investment, so that both through enterprises and through larger entities. Just to give a couple examples of what we're doing in the construction sector, it was identified that one of the issues was that there are skills gaps. We worked with a lead firm, connected them with a technical vocational school, also working with the government entity responsible for certification to develop new trainings that are being delivered in that TVET. These trainings reflect the competencies required by enterprises, by the sector, and the results have been strong, producing graduates who actually are meeting the needs of the employers. Looking at construction, we've partnered with some companies, construction companies both in the U.S. and Canada to bring in technical assistance to train skilled laborers with the skills that are needed, reflecting codes, construction codes, standards that are far superior to what exists in Haiti. Let me move on to give a little bit more about Haiti. The reason this program was designed was the high unemployment and the need for economic growth. Haiti unemployment is driven both by the skill gaps that I mentioned earlier, but also really a lack of jobs. There aren't enough jobs to particularly absorb the young population that's growing. 60% of the population works in agriculture, yet the infrastructure, both because it was, of the earthquake, but also previously, it's never had a very strong infrastructure in terms of transport, in terms of production facilities. Technology is not necessarily up to international standards, so there's room for improving that. In terms of human resources, the workforce, as I mentioned, definitely there's spaces to improve the skills, the institutes that are able to support all levels of workers, whether it's low education to high education. So while there's a weak infrastructure, there's a lot of opportunities that have emerged. There are a number of industrial parks that have both been upgraded since the earthquake, and a number of new ones that have come in. Transport is improving. It remains problematic, but there are a large number of opportunities. So through an assessment done by RTI under LEVE, we identified through conversations with, I think, over 200 different enterprises, these sectors, as well as started this a facilitative process where we, as the program, facilitated upgrades in the value chain through these tools, technical assistance and co-investment. We basically looked to those enterprises that we started working with for their suggestions and worked in partnership to solve their problems, create opportunities, and introduce activities that would upgrade. So I think I don't want to take too much time. I want to get to the heart of the presentation. So at this point, I will turn it over to Jared. If there are any specific questions about LEVE or Haiti, I can answer those during the question and answer. So Jared.
Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate the intro and background on Haiti. I think it gives a nice motivation to the need for this work. To give a brief overview of the analysis before I give a longer description, the main purpose was that we wanted to identify what were the impacts of the work that LEVE was doing in the Haitian apparel sector to increase employment there. Specifically, we were interested in the indirect and induced economic impact of that job creation. And what I mean by that, by indirect impacts, are jobs that would come alongside of the jobs that were created directly, preparing apparel, sewing and preparing it for shipment to the United States and some other markets, though largely the United States. And those jobs would occur either up the management chain within the apparel industry or throughout the broader apparel supply chain elsewhere in Haiti. So you might imagine if you're running an apparel firm in Haiti, you need suppliers to help you get your product to and from the port, your supplies to and from the port. You also need things like energy, cardboard boxes, plastic bags, and so forth. And some of that is domestically supplied, though as we'll talk about later, a lot of that is imported, and that's an opportunity for growth and the type of impacts that apparel sector work can have. And then the induced impacts are coming from the wages spent by the apparel employees as they leave their job and take their wages out into Haitian society. And so in this image below, you see a marketplace outside of what is an industrial park, I believe, is selling all kinds of things to people as they're coming and going from work. And this is another form of economic activity that is bound to grow when more people are employed sewing apparel. So the approach that we took was to combine multiple data sources because the data for Haiti are fair to poor, and so we needed to draw on a variety of sources to get a true economic picture of Haiti. And that combines both input-output data, which I'll describe in a little bit from the Global Trade Analysis Project for the Caribbean region, and then interviews and surveys that we conducted in Haiti to get a better picture of what the local economic conditions were. So let's take a look at the apparel sector as a whole. Starting in the upper left here, some of the countries that Haiti identifies as key competitors in the region: El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Guatemala. These are similarly positioned countries for export to the United States. They, of course, pale in comparison to some of the notable East Asian giants like China and Vietnam, who are exporting far more far larger dollar value to the United States. But Haiti really looks to their regional competitors to understand what are some of their opportunities for growth and what are who are some of their key competitors within their the slice of the market that they serve. You can see Haiti trails these three by quite a bit, and in between Guatemala and Haiti, the Dominican Republic falls somewhere in the low 20s, I believe, in terms of the ranking we have here. The growth in the industry is the next thing, and this bar chart at the bottom left is we're showing the growth in employment broken out by the different industrial parks throughout Haiti. In 3 of the 6 we have presented here, we conducted our surveys. We hired a local survey firm called SocioDige, and they provided a small team of surveyors that went out with tablets based on a survey that we provided to them, and they translated into Creole. They collected information from apparel workers as they were coming and going from their jobs. So the three parks that we conducted these surveys, or that SocioDige conducted these surveys at, were the 2 Sonapi parks. That's the National Parks Association in Haiti. PIM and PIC. That's PIM is Parc Industriel Metropolitain, is the park based in Port-au-Prince, and PIC, the park based in Caracol, in the north of the country, that received some attention in the past year around its involvement, the Clinton Global Initiative's involvement in that work. And then the final park was Cote V, which is in the northeast near the border with the Dominican. So on the right-hand side here, if we're interested in understanding what the supply chain looks like for apparel, it is global, and we want to think of apparel manufacturers as sitting in the center, and then the suppliers in the top panel, and the finishing and distribution of the apparel goods following manufacturing. And one of the keys to understanding the broader impact of employment in this sector is understanding how do these sectors relate to each other and what sort of economic linkages exist. Focusing on apparel manufacturers, there are two broad categories that we want to highlight: these cut and make operations, sometimes cut, make, and trim, versus full package operations. The cut and make operations are the predominant form of manufacturing within Haiti at the moment. And these operations are fairly simple in terms of the services they provide. They receive a shipment of raw materials, they sew and assemble them, put them back in the container, and ship them back to their customers. So there's very little to no actual management of the supply chain by those manufacturing firms. They are simply providing the labor services to their clients to assemble the product and ship it back to them. They don't ever take ownership of the product. They simply provide a labor service. Versus the full package manufacturing, they're going to take ownership of the product. They'll take more responsibility for the type of for who their suppliers are, and they'll also have now give them the freedom to select local suppliers in Haiti to the extent that they exist, which wouldn't necessarily be available to a cut and make operation. And so in the final column here, we've listed some of the businesses that we interviewed in Haiti, and you can see that for the suppliers as well. Examples of types of suppliers are raw materials, energy and capital providers, and other support services. Astrocarton is a provider of cardboard boxes. They'll package the finished apparel and ship it off. So you can see we interviewed a wide variety of both apparel manufacturers and their suppliers that they helped put us in touch with. So let's get a high-level overview first of some of the results from this work. As I mentioned before, we are interested in understanding the impacts of employment in the apparel sector, and specifically how do those jobs relate to employment in the rest of the economy? And if we look at this table in the bottom, we have about 41,000 jobs in the apparel sector currently in Haiti. And we want to know elsewhere in the supply chain how many jobs are active. And our baseline estimate, we had about 11,500 other jobs active, providing supplies to the apparel sector and helping the apparel sector get their product to market. And on top of that, another 13,500 jobs supporting the consumption that the apparel workers are spending their wages on in Haitian markets. So when you think of the economic scale of apparel sector employment, you want to think more broadly than just the number of people that are actively sewing apparel in the sector, that 41,000. You really want to think more in terms of this total 66,000 approximately that we see when we account for the indirect and induced labor that comes alongside that direct employment. So this top bullet here, and sorry for going out of order there, but this gives a little bit more qualitative picture of what employment, what sort of economic opportunity apparel sector employment is bringing to the Haitian economy, and people looking for better economic opportunity in Haiti. So of the people that we surveyed about 1,200 people across the 3 parks, about evenly distributed. More women than men, as that reflects the rough distribution of employment there. About 93% of our respondents said that the apparel job that they held was important to their households. And about 80% of them said that their earnings were now higher as a result of taking the job relative to what they were doing before, which was quite often unemployment. 3/4 said their households were experiencing better economic health overall, and almost 2/3 said that their spending had increased in important categories like education and durable goods that help improve their sort of economic quality of life. So let's just get a brief overview of how we collected some of the data that we did in Haiti. We break it down into two different categories: the surveys, and interviews. So with respect to the surveys, this is who we hired the local firm Sociodis to conduct these surveys. As I mentioned before, we put together a list of questions for survey respondents. In particular, we spent a lot of time on apparel workers, and we were interested in things like the basic demographics, what their income and expenses look like, and what their previous employment was. The goal here was twofold. One was to understand what is the pattern of their expenditures and how is that going to drive induced economic impacts in the Haitian economy. And the second is what is their overall, the more qualitative aspects of their economic experience in joining the apparel sector. The other group that we contracted Sociodis to survey were the local park vendors. We wanted to know how much, to what extent did their livelihoods depend, their businesses depend on the wages spent by apparel sector workers. And so we surveyed about 100 of these vendors, and that's across the 3 parks. And primarily, we were interested in the extent to which their business would spend on apparel workers, how many people they were employing, and what their general scale of operations were. And then the second method of data collection that we did was interviews. These were conducted by myself, others at RTI, Alan O'Connor, is a colleague of mine, and Amanda Walsh, another colleague of mine, along with some local staff from our LEVE office, and one individual who from the local industry association who helped us make the contacts that we needed in country. With respect to the apparel manufacturers themselves, we spoke with 6 firms in Port-au-Prince, and these 6 firms were responsible for about nearly 1/4 of employment in the industry as a whole. So even though it's a small number of firms, we interviewed a couple of large firms that had a significant amount, that were responsible for a significant amount of apparel employment, and a few other smaller firms. And the questions there focused on their distribution of costs, and that again is important for understanding how their operations link to the rest of the Haitian economy. We talked about growth scenarios, who their key suppliers were, and they helped us get in touch with suppliers so we could then interview, as you see below, seven supplying firms from a variety of industries, and these were all in Port-au-Prince. And asked them about their income and expenditures so we could better understand how their operations linked the apparel sector, linked with the apparel sector, and then linked further to the rest of the Haitian economy. So some brief results here from the surveys and interviews, focusing on what we heard from the employees, the apparel sector employees. The average age here was about 30, with an average education of 10 years or so. Relatively few of the respondents were married. And with respect to earnings, the average wage was about 300 to 400 Haitian gourd per day, which is on the order of $5 or a little more, which relative to their earnings prior to taking the apparel job was a significant improvement. It's a significant increase, so of 50 to 250 Haitian gourd per day at the median. So while these wages are likely not impressive for many relative to the opportunity that the respondents faced prior to these jobs being available, there's certainly an improvement, and that was reflected in what they reported in terms of their economic conditions. 3/4 of them saying that their household's economic conditions were better or much better, and many of them reporting, again, increased expenditures in important categories that help support their economic well-being. And then the last point here is that the high level of unemployment prior to taking these jobs. So nearly 40% of respondents were not employed, underemployed, or in some cases employed but in informal ways. And so this would not be included in the 40%, but that is one aspect of the economic growth story here, is understanding how the labor formalization process can help contribute to the supporting civil society and government operations. So just looking at the average daily income on the right-hand side, this gives you a rough idea of breaking out by the different parks and the tenure of the respondents. There's very slight growth in wages over time as you work longer. One criticism that we heard voiced from Apparel employees. And then in the bottom panel we see the median income gains broken up by the different parks where we conducted our surveys. So the next thing I want to focus on is the data that we collected from the manufacturers themselves. And the key thing here is understanding the breakout of their costs. So we know that when they receive, say, an order for $100 worth of T-shirts, where does that $100 go? How much of it stays within the Haitian economy, and how much of it goes elsewhere? So the largest cost for cut and make operations was labor, and the largest cost for full package operations was materials. And that again reflects the fact that that cut and make operations are not taking ownership of the materials that they're assembling, whereas full package operations are. And so you see that in this right-hand panel here, where you compare the labor share of costs. This minimum of 20% is a full package operation, where the maximum of 80% is a cut and make operation. And essentially that reflects the fact that in the cut and make operation, the cost of material is not factored in, so the labor is going to take up a much larger share of total expenses. You see that in the reverse in the materials and supplies category, that 5% is your cut and make operation that's not taking ownership of the raw material inputs, and so it's not including that in its cost structure, versus the 60% for the full package operation, which is. So some of the benefits of full package, we see that one of the aspects of transition for this industry in Haiti is this movement from cut and make to full package operations. And so we wanted to get a clearer picture of what sort of economic benefits might that present for the industry and Haiti as a whole. We found that full package operations are going to employ more staff. As I mentioned before, they're going to be able to have the freedom to choose their suppliers, and that might include supporting domestic industries to develop and grow. As a result of this, the employment in full package operations is going to have a larger economic impact relative to cut and make operations. In part because full package operations are going to employ more management and administrative staff to manage the sort of broader scale of operations that they're taking responsibility for. So that brings up a qualitative point on the type of job growth that's occurring. That these full package operations are going to be able to support quote-unquote middle-class jobs where people are having more opportunity for promotion into managerial or administrative role that can provide for a higher salary base than you would have available in a cut-and-make operation. We view that as a positive development, and we think that as the industry develops more, that in transitions toward more full package operations, that the economic impacts of labor growth in that sector will grow. overall, the manufacturers were quite bullish in their projections of future growth, 10 to 25%. And they identified a few factors that they thought would influence that growth. Political stability was probably first and foremost of all the manufacturers that we interviewed as a potential concern. Those of you familiar with Haiti will find this as no surprise. There's, I won't comment at length on the political situation there, but there is a certain, for lack of a better term, volatility to it and uncertainty for manufacturers operating there. And the wage stability, their concern there, manufacturers seem to have a very keen understanding of at what prices, labor prices, they can be competitive in the international market. As those of you familiar with the global supply chain for apparel may well know, it's an incredibly competitive market, and there's only certain cost structures that the market will support. And then the final was the quality of infrastructure. For anyone who's traveled to Haiti, you know that SUVs are required equipment to traverse the streets, and getting your materials to and from port it can be a challenge for the manufacturers here. Among other things like the quality of electricity, many of the manufacturers run their own generators so that they can, and this is at sort of not much of a cost disadvantage and certainly a quality improvement for them. So these are all factors that make for a challenging business environment for these manufacturers. So let's talk about the impact estimates. What I've just gone through is how did we collect all the data that we needed to understand what were the local economic conditions in Haiti, and we're going to combine those data with the data for input-output data for the Caribbean region as a whole from the Global Trade Analysis Project, and those combined sources are going to give us a more complete picture of the Haitian economy and allow us to estimate some of these impacts in what is in economics a fairly standard input-output calculation of labor multipliers. So again, the direct impacts are those 41,000 people employed in the apparel sector, or if we're thinking about just the work that LEVE is doing, the few thousand people that they have helped gain employment in that sector. The indirect jobs are the jobs either managing those employees within the apparel sector or manufacturing supplies for the apparel sector or helping the apparel sector get its product to market. So jobs elsewhere in the apparel supply chain that are active within Haiti. And then induce the jobs that the apparel workers themselves are supporting by spending their incomes locally. So let's just give an example of what is it that we're calculating and what are we trying to understand. I mentioned before an example of $100 in apparel revenue coming into Haiti to purchase, and we want to know how much of that $100 is going to stay in Haiti in the form of domestic wages, either paid by the apparel sector or paid elsewhere in the Haitian economy. So let's say, for example, that of that $100, $30 is labor costs, and so we have $30 of that 100 that's going to domestic wages from the apparel sector, and then the remaining 70 the apparel manufacturer, let's say, is going to pay to its suppliers, and half of those suppliers are foreign, and so it doesn't matter what those foreign suppliers do with that money, if they spend it all on labor or none, it's not going to count for our purposes because those are labor expenses occurring outside of Haiti. Next we have, but of the $35 spent on given to domestic suppliers, say they spend 10 of those $10 of that income on wages. That's another $10 in Haitian wages paid as a result of that $100 of apparel revenue coming into the country. So when we add that up to look at the domestic wages, we're looking at $40 in in wages paid. And this gives us an implied multiplier of 1.33, that is 40 divided by 30. So for $30 in direct wages in the apparel sector, the total wages paid in the Haitian economy as a result of that activity was actually 40. So that's what the multiplier is. That's what we're looking to calculate here based on our understanding of the economic relationships between the different sectors. And if we look at our baseline estimate, we have the 41,000 jobs. Again, the about 11,500 jobs elsewhere in Haiti in the apparel sector supply chain, and 13,500 elsewhere in Haiti supporting consumption by apparel workers. So we're considering this 66,000 approximately jobs as being part of the apparel sector's broader economic impact, or an implied multiplier of 1.61. That is, for every one job in the apparel sector, 0.61 jobs elsewhere in the economy are active as supporting that activity. So just to give a recap on the calculation that we did, we made a few different adjustments to make the standard calculation better reflect the economic conditions in Haiti. The one was to update the cost shares, or the expenditure profile of the manufacturers based on the interview data that we collected. The other was to adjust for imports. Haiti is very, very import dependent, and the more you import, the more of the or I guess the less possibility you have for additional indirect impacts from your spending on suppliers, because that money is leaving the country, as opposed to supporting a domestic industry who will pay wages in Haiti. And then the direct labor we made an adjustment to. We were just focusing on the apparel, the sewers and the factory floor labor, so to speak, in the apparel sector. And so we're including in this multiplier the managerial staff that would be within the apparel sector that would be needed to support the factory floor labor. So when we compare this this multiplier to similar calculations for the top 20 apparel exporters globally that we saw in that table at the outset, it's quite a bit lower, and there are a few different reasons for that. And we view this as giving some picture of where the direction where Haiti might expect to grow to in terms as its apparel industry matures and grows more toward full package operations, is able to support more domestic suppliers, that it might ultimately be able to have a higher multiplier, similar to some of its competitors in the global market. So there are a couple of, to that end, we did a couple of sensitivities to understand how do the labor impact estimates change when we increase the labor input share or decrease it, when we change the amount that's imported, and when we transition the labor structure for the apparel sector toward full package operations. And these are all reflective of different potential future paths that the labor sector, that the apparel sector in Haiti might take. So let me summarize with a few key takeaways from what we learned from this project. As I mentioned at the outset, our sort of initial goal was to calculate these impacts that we've just reviewed. But along the way, we needed to collect a lot of data that reflected local economic conditions in Haiti. And we ended up looking more closely at some of the qualitative aspects of what apparel sector work is like in Haiti, and what sort of economic opportunity is it offering to Haitian households. And I think that we learned a lot more than just the initial intent of the analysis might have suggested. So the headline number that we had was this approximately 25,000 indirect and induced jobs that come along with the 41,000 jobs already active in the apparel sector. So just giving people that broader perspective of the economy-wide impact of the apparel sector is larger than just the number of people employed directly by the sector, is an important consideration for policymakers, development professionals, and others to bear in mind as they consider how they might approach the apparel sector and its development and growth. The employees themselves, and these are some of the qualitative aspects I mentioned, they report a number of benefits from taking the work, including higher earnings, better economic conditions for their households, increased expenditures on important things like education, and all relative to high prior unemployment. So these are all positive. Some concerns that we seem to find some indication, some support for in the data we collected were a lack of promotion opportunities. Again, we saw sort of limited growth in wages over employees' tenures, and a quota system, which is essentially a requirement for earning the wages that they're intended for the sewing positions, and that those quotas can sometimes be difficult to meet, and that we saw some possible indication that may be there may be some validity to that critique. The firms that we interviewed have seen a lot of growth recently, and they're transitioning to this full package operations, which we view as important development, and they identified a number of potential areas of concern for the political and economic situation in Haiti and the future of their businesses. So the overall value add to this work that we envision is helping to communicate the broader economic development story of the individual employment initiatives that LEVE are taking. How do those jobs for individuals create broader economic value throughout the economy? And taking that economy-wide economic development perspective, I think helps provide important perspective on the overall development goals of work like this. So going forward, I think some of the other applications that this work has potential to touch on are applying this in different contexts. So there are different industries that we could touch on and apply this approach to. This approach could certainly be applied to the apparel industry in different sectors, and also extensions to understand to get a better counterfactual on growth in sectors like this. Looking at surveying, doing population surveys before apparel manufacturers open operations and after, so we have a clearer picture of economic outcomes before and after the so-called intervention by the apparel industry, and understanding, getting a deeper understanding of how the supply chain is operating in each of the countries. So I think with that, I'm going to wrap up and pass things over to Rachel, and I welcome the questions that have been coming in the chat, and we'll allow Rachel to moderate those. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jared. And I echo your extension or your welcome for those of you that are listening right now to feel free to ask any questions in the chat window. I'm just going to talk very quickly, and before we get into those questions, you know, when I learn about these kinds of measurement tools, such as this one, I'm always thinking to myself, okay, what question is this answering, or how does this help my decision making, and you know, how can this tool be adapted for my own program purposes? And I think Jared just provided a really wonderful explanation of how a tool like this can provide a snapshot for policy purposes or for decision making by USAID, by donors, even by the Haitian government. And I really appreciate the thought and the detail in terms of how you folks at RTI have estimated the number of jobs and looking at the benchmarking of the industry, the cost structure, and especially the indirect and the induced impact of the indirect jobs and the induced jobs. What I find really interesting about LEVE is that, you know, as you've heard Sarah and Jared talk about, this is a value chain project, but it also has a skills development component. And they recognize that higher skilled workers is one of the necessary components for competitiveness of the apparel sector. And, you know, if we sort of speak very generally and reductionist, you know, generally these kinds of our value chain programs or competitiveness programs often seek to improve the performance of sectors. Or they might be looking at what are the impacts on lead firms or specific market actors within a sector. And oftentimes you'll see that these kinds of programs measure impacts at the firm or sector level. So they'll be looking at things like revenues or profitability or foreign direct investment. And then on the other hand, on the other side of the spectrum, you'll have conventional workforce development programs or skills development programs that tend to measure results at the individual level. So they might be looking at the skills gained by young people or the employment or income status of the job seeker or worker. Now, what I find interesting about LEVE is that they're looking at both. And for a context like Haiti, and Jared mentioned that, you know, the country has been dealing with decades of protracted conflict, and that this conflict is often fueled by tensions between those that are considered the elite or industry leaders and the broader population. And so for a program like LEVE, measuring these social impacts as well as the economic impacts is very important. And I appreciate that, you know, this tool is capturing not just the impact on jobs, but actually the qualitative aspect of those jobs. So one of the things that I think that's really interesting about this tool is that it could be a jumping off point to measure some of those, to give that qualitative picture and measure those social impacts, things like the benefits to the individual workers, and Jared mentioned things like the better economic health and the higher earnings, and even the purchase of some of these goods like electronics or land or livestock or education. And it'd be interesting to see, you know, how this tool could be a jumping off point for looking at other social benefits, whether it's savings or health or the consumption of food or even gender dynamics, and even looking at the impact to not just the workers, but even the micro enterprise vendors, because they represent about 11,000 jobs. And certainly I could see there being effects for those vendors as well, and some of those social impact. Jared also mentioned the quality of employment, so some of the issues with the production quotas. You could also even look at turnover within the sector and whether that's changing. And also the other thing that I found interesting was looking at the percentage, the high percentage, I think it was 38%, of those who had no prior work. So you can even look at this as a way to, a segue for measuring employability of workers and whether or not, what percentage of workers were new entrants to the work world, you know, to what extent did this employment in the sector impact the long-term employability of that worker over time. And I think what, you know, going back on these societal benefits, I think what's really interesting is this notion of moving from a cut and make to a full package model. And it gets to what I see as a second utility of this analytical approach, which is this could be used as a forecasting tool to inform policy, because it essentially talks about a narrative of where the sector should be headed and where it is headed. And the slides where Jared explained the benefits, the economic impact of moving from a cut and make model to a full package model really presents a nice story of how this really, how upgrading of the sector could really have these kinds of benefits for workers and for society, and because of the employment gains. And I think that it really highlights an interesting tension that you often see in value chain programs, where there's a tension between these social benefits and the economic benefits to the industry.
oftentimes USAID has seen in other competitiveness or value chain programs, they've seen examples of how upgrading an industry, often by leading, it leads to productivity. It might even lead to increased mechanization and a reduction in the number of jobs. And so what I think is really interesting about this modeling that Jared's presented is that they've actually sort of forecasted or extended out what does that look like in terms of employment, and the presentation of how upgrading of the sector and moving to a full package model in fact does have employment gains, or results in employment gains, not just in terms of the number of indirect and induced jobs, but also in the quality of jobs. And so I think in that regard, looking at that trajectory, I think that can be a useful tool to inform how the Haitian government might invest in a skills policy, whether it's investing in skills development of those kinds of workers that we expect to see over time. There was a mention of wage policy and how important that is to keeping the sector competitive. And it could also inform infrastructure investment, as Jared had suggested, and looking at the importance of that on the sector as well. And then finally, I think the interesting thing, and Jared, you just touched on this, and I think I'm going to ask you to comment on that a bit, is the usefulness of this tool for measuring project impact and for monitoring over time, and so doing some more longitudinal analysis. And you mentioned this idea of conducting pre- and post-surveys to establish a counterfactual, and I'd love to hear more about that, especially because there has been recent attention by USAID on the impact of skills development programs on job creation. And so I'd be really interested to hear about, how if you were to do this, again, as a post-test following the project completion, what adjustments would you make? How would you go about actually doing that? So I'll leave it at that. And I guess I'll start with that question, which is around, what were the resources involved in this process of capturing this data, both in terms of time and the resources required? And then if you were to do it again, I guess the question is, would you do it again as a post-test? And if so, or even if not, what would that look like? I'll leave it to you, Jared or Sarah, to answer that question.
Great. Thank you very much, Rachel. That really helps set the broader context for this work and tie some of the pieces together, some of the loose ends that I left you brought together nicely. So thank you. Just before I respond to your longitudinal question, I would be remiss not to provide some acknowledgments to all the folks that help support this work. Most importantly, USAID and their Haiti mission. Their evaluation and economic growth teams. LEVE, of course, was the local office in Haiti that is managing all of this work. The survey firm that we work with, Socio-Dige, the Haitian Apparel, or the Bar Industrial Association, ADI, in Haiti, and the apparel manufacturers, their suppliers, employees, and local street vendors, all of which provided some of the local data that we've relied on to do this work. So proper thanks to all of those groups. So with respect to your question on a more longitudinal perspective and understanding how an analysis like this might change if we had sort of more time or the ability to do a series of measurements, I think certainly we would be interested in conducting the same or similar survey before and after the expansion of apparel operations, but the sort of that clean experimental perspective is obviously difficult to identify in the real world, particularly in a place like Port-au-Prince, where there is so much economic activity going on now that I'm trying to and there's so much apparel activity going on already, it would be hard to distinguish, an individual firm's expansion in that very active and dynamic economy. Where I think you have potential to get a cleaner understanding of the impact is some of these industrial parks that have opened in more rural areas where economic activity is much, for lack of a better term, simpler, where you have a largely agrarian economy operating with very few markets for goods and services. That you, and where the apparel sector expansion is planned well in advance, and there's this sort of new construction. So, for example, the Caracol Park in the north would have been a perfect opportunity to do something along those lines. There are also new private parks that are opening. Those tend to be closer to Port-au-Prince, so maybe not as great an opportunity there. But I think understanding, getting a full picture of the economic livelihood of households in a given area before and after the introduction of apparel operations, and then looking and tracing some of the changes in economic activity after, or the economic livelihoods of the household after the apparel sector shows up, and trying to understand, can we identify specific individuals that would fit into the categories that would, these indirect and induced labor impact categories that we identify from a more macro perspective. In that sense, I think that would be the most powerful validation of this tool, is identifying specific individuals that have benefited in exactly the way this macro perspective input-output multiplier approach suggests.
And Jared, just from RTI's perspective, what was the biggest lesson that you folks gained from this process, or do you take away from this and apply to other contexts?
I think understanding the local context of how does, you take an example of the apparel sector. It's a global market. It's a global supply chain. But each part of that supply chain that's contributed to from each country is going to have its own nuances and individual economic circumstances that are going to make that participation in that global supply chain, which is so competitive, still unique in how they, what sort of constraints that each of the individual firms faces in order to produce their products, and what kind of constraints there are on the economic opportunity that they can actually offer. And I think that was one of the most revealing aspects of this project to me, was getting a clearer understanding of what was preventing even more economic opportunity from unfolding, and what I think that's where a project like LEVE can have the most impact, is trying to work to relieve some of those constraints and unlock some additional economic opportunity.
Yeah, and I think that also underscores the utility of this as almost as a policy forecasting or policy informational or a discussion point for policymakers. I'm going to turn it over to some of the questions here that we're getting in the chat window. There's several questions about the some of these social benefits. And Sarah, maybe some of these questions are directed to you as much as they are to Jared in terms of the interventions. There's some questions around women's economic empowerment, and to what extent is this program encouraging female employment. And maybe, Jared, you can talk about whether there were any findings that were gender-related, and also people with disabilities, about whether there's any specific considerations for that. And then also there was a question earlier about wages, in terms of whether the cut and make movement to full package would impact the wages for production workers, so whether we might expect to see either a decrease or increase. So just maybe comment a bit on those social impacts.
Sure, thanks, Rachel. I can start off. So one thing I just want to emphasize is that the general approach to this project is facilitative. So we are facilitators working as a partner to value chain actors that they identify what are the challenges that they are facing in improving their productivity, improving their income, and hiring employees. So basically through these original assessments that I talked about where we worked with over 200 different value chain actors, in addition to picking the areas, well, actually those were picked, the specific elements of the value chain, they were what they brought to the table. So it was only when there was a lead entity that was willing to take a risk and had a vision for how to improve. That's where we worked. So we did not direct anything. There was no direct implementation through this project. We were providing technical assistance. Some of the basically the subsidies were through how we could support through technical assistance, background research, information dissemination, bridging partnerships, and kind of being that kind of honest broker. So the answer is that no, there was none of the partnerships that we developed and the activities involved a focus on gender or on soft skills or disabilities. Now, those, that definitely were impacts in those areas, but that was not a specific target of the project, nor was it something that was brought through or implemented in the activities we did. So what else? Did I miss something, or Jared, do you want to give, I think there was a question about did anything come out on more, gender issues, but I think that's pretty much the extent of the project, focus on that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can respond somewhat to the gender dynamics. As I mentioned, the apparel workers are the majority of the apparel workers are female, and they so there is a sense in which it presents the economic opportunity it presents is relatively biased towards women, and whether or not that changes dynamics within the household, that's not something that we necessarily, that wasn't something that we were trying to elicit from our surveys. That said, we have a wealth of data in our surveys that we didn't present here, that we are actually in the process of trying to find ways to explore, trying to identify certain questions that we might like to ask, research questions that we might like to ask and explore using those data. So we would certainly be back in touch to the extent that we are coming out with new findings there. I will say that the wages, there was a slight wage discrepancy in between men and women in the sector, indicating that women were earning slightly less. We're not certain what that is attributable to, if it's strictly bias or if there if some other sort of factors that maybe men tend to be employed, have been employed slightly longer or than women on average, or something along those lines.
Great, thank you. We are running about 4 minutes. I'll just take one more question. There is questions around the role of government in this process, and I think I'll just go back to the earlier conversation, which is around this tool as a policy-making tool or a point of departure for policy making. So to what extent has the program engaged government in this process or used the findings of your analysis to inform government policy?
So I think
go
ahead, Derek.
Go ahead.
I can respond after. Go ahead.
Okay. I would just say that the LEVE office is working with the Industry Association, and they'll be holding public presentations of this work and trying to engage policymakers. I think the Industrial Association will probably rely on some of this work and its ongoing efforts to collaborate with policymakers in Haiti to provide a supportive environment for the industry, and so it'll be somewhat indirect, but I think it's going to feed through and through those channels.
If I could jump in with a practical example of how they're using basically what we're learning. I mean, a lot of this goes to support the work that's being done, saying, look, it has this broader impact, which I think is relevant to all youth practitioners. We need to show more and more that we're having this impact. So in the case of the construction, I mentioned how the government has come in recognizing this need to cultivate and improve the workforce, and has partnered. So we've worked with the government body that approves and informs curriculums for technical vocational schools, and they were really involved and supported this effort to create competency-based training curriculum that meet the skills of the employees. So that meant the government was on board, putting time into being in these sessions that developed the trainings where employers were sitting there with the curriculum developers to make this training that is now being rolled out in TVETs. So that's kind of a practical policy implication, that understanding that what LEVE is doing, where they're facilitating these changes, connecting private sector and education and government, is working.
That's great. Well, I think that's a good place to end in terms of going full circle and concluding this presentation. Sarah, Sladen, do you want to say any closing remarks?
Thanks so much, everyone, for joining today's webinar. We look forward to sharing best practices in workforce development programming at the 2017 Global Youth Economic Opportunities Summit. It's taking place September 29th in Washington, D.C. And you can learn more about this event, which will touch on some of the topics discussed today, at youtheosummit.org. At the end of today's event, we will also recommend a survey online, and this takes less than 2 minutes of your time. So we really appreciate you filling out the survey so that we can be sure that the webinar topics we pursue in 2017 and 2018 are relevant. This webinar has been recorded, and it will be posted on youtheconomicopportunities.org, and you'll receive a link to that via email after the webinar. And if you found this webinar useful, please let others know in your networks. We encourage you to promote the webinar's recording to others. So thank you again to our speakers, and everybody have a great rest of your week.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, bye.